In August of 2022, conservation workers in New Zealand spent $500,000 to catch a single stoat. The hunt took 8 months and involved setting up traps and trail cameras, stoat-sniffing dogs, using boats and helicopters to reach remote areas. To understand why they would do this, we need to go back 140 years when stoats first arrived in New Zealand. 800 years when humans first arrived, 8,000 years when lush rainforests expanded across these islands, even 80 million years when this landmass became isolated from the rest of the world. This was the last major landmass to be settled by humans, one of the most isolated places on Earth. And in that isolation, it's evolved into something completely unique, one of the world's most biodiverse ecosystems, with a high proportion of endemic species found only here, and of ancient species, living fossils from past geological eras. Today, new species continue to be found here, while others continue to disappear, because New Zealand's landscape has been built out of contradictions. It is one of the most rapidly and thoroughly altered landscapes on Earth, but also one of the most untouched. A place where geology and evolution are laid bare, where so many discoveries have been made, but a place that hides so much and where so many mysteries remain. A place so aggressively alive, yet so endangered. New Zealand's story is one of imperial greed and broken promises, one we've heard so many times before. But it is one of the few countries trying to make amends, to take on the ambitious, unprecedented, and at times controversial task of rebuilding this prehistoric landscape, this forest at the bottom of the world.
Day one in New Zealand. Making these videos has taken me to a lot of incredible places, but I don't know, New Zealand just feels a little different. Feeling very lucky and very excited to be here.
More than 100 million years ago, much of the land in the southern hemisphere formed a single supercontinent called Gondwana. About 80 million years ago, a piece broke off and began drifting into the Southern Ocean. In the millions of years following, mammals evolved, becoming larger and more advanced, dominating food chains and spreading all across the globe. But they couldn't get here. And in their absence, something different developed. A world of birds. They evolved to fill the roles that mammals would elsewhere. Rather than deer or cattle, large flightless birds called moa grazed the forests and grasslands, some standing 10 feet tall. Rather than wolves, they were hunted by the world's largest eagle with a 10-foot wingspan. Instead of weasels or rabbits, flightless kiwi with fur-like feathers dug burrows in the forest floor. And with no small mammals like mice, invertebrates became large and flightless. Giant snails, giant slugs, the world's largest insect. Being hunted by other birds, small birds didn't learn to fly. They learned to hide. The evolution of mammals put new pressure on the world's plants, birds, and invertebrates, forcing evolution and causing widespread extinctions. But here, they survived. This landmass is home to very old species, plants and animals largely unchanged since this land first broke away, like the tuatara, the last survivor of an ancient branch of reptiles, and the flightless kakapo, the world's largest parrot, believed to be a relic from the forests of Gondwana. As mammals took over the rest of the world, this landmass changed in its own ways. Plate tectonics built high mountains. The climate cooled, burying those mountains under ice sheets and carving a landscape of deep valleys, steep cliffs, fjords and lakes dotted with hundreds of islands. These ancient forests and their strange birds survived in small pockets at the edge of the ice, along the coast or sheltered inland mountains. Around 15,000 years ago, the climate started to become warmer and wetter. The ice sheets retreated, the forests expanded to cover most of the land, and this became one of the rainiest places on Earth, with the mountains of the southwest receiving nearly 1,000 centimeters of rain each year. Behind those mountains sat a large rain shadow, a flatter landscape covered in drier, more open forest. Heavy rains erode gorges, flood valleys downstream, cause tree avalanches where entire sections of forest collapse, and they carve a landscape of water, rivers, waterfalls, lakes, and wetlands. The wetlands are particularly biodiverse, providing key habitat for birds and fish. The richest are those at low elevations, covering vast stretches of flat land near the coast. Heavy rains in the mountains pour a continuous supply of fresh water down the slopes and into the fjords below. That water is darkened by dissolved material picked up from the forest floor and sits on top of the fjord's salt water, blocking out most sunlight. Underneath, you'll find a marine world that looks more like the deep ocean, where creatures adapted to life in much deeper waters live just below the surface. The fjords and their surrounding waters are home to several species of dolphin, including Hector's dolphin, the world's smallest and rarest, found only here, and several species of whales, sperm whales, pilot whales, right whales, killer whales, humpback whales. Dotting the coast are large colonies of fur seals, along with smaller populations of sea lions and visiting elephant seals and leopard seals. Hiding from the larger seals and sea lions are two endemic penguins, yellow-eyed penguins and fjordland crested penguins. Nesting in forests and frequenting the high mountains is the kea, the world's only alpine parrot. The forest floor is home to more than 26,000 invertebrates, 90% found only here. 1,400 snails, 2,000 moths, endemic geckos and skinks, ancient spiders and frogs, glowworms. This evolved into one of the most biodiverse and unique places on the entire planet. All thanks to this complete isolation from the rest of the world. Around 800 years ago, the first humans reached this landmass, Polynesians from the tropical islands to the north. They quickly populated this new land and explored its offshore islands. They ventured into its most remote rainforests and fjords, connected the highest mountains with a network of trails, and they gave this new place a name, Aotearoa. They set up shop on the more accessible eastern side, hunting seals and sea lions on the coast, and venturing inland to hunt moa and other large flightless birds. And they introduced species of their own, dogs intentionally and rats accidentally. Dogs hunted native birds, while the rats ate birds' eggs and competed with them for food. In the century following their arrival, Polynesian settlers lit fires, burning vast stretches of this forest. In the tropical islands further north, deliberately burning forests like this may have helped to keep them healthy, but Aotearoa's forests are different. These trees are often completely killed by fire and may take centuries to regenerate. So rather than reestablishing, slow-growing saplings were snuffed out by fire-tolerant grasses and ferns, and much of this forest was replaced by a vast open grassland. By the 1600s, half of Aotearoa's forests were gone, along with half of its bird species, several species of frogs and lizards, and countless invertebrates. Other species survived, but were pushed into isolated pockets, like the tuatara, surviving on offshore islands the rats couldn't reach. Many species, like the kakapo and the fur seal, found refuge in the dense rainforests and remote fjords of the far southwest coast, a place too rugged to settle and too wet to burn. With moa and seals gone and the forest not regenerating, it became clear that Polynesian settlers needed to be a bit more careful. Villages became smaller, concentrated near rich wetlands, and surviving by fishing, foraging, and farming. A culture and legal system developed based on sustaining Aotearoa for future generations, with different families and individuals entrusted with managing different resources. Different groups called iwi held rights to occupy land and use resources, often overlapping with other groups. The right to use a certain area or resource was based on an ancestral history of use, and that was often proven by recounting narratives of ancestral use and occupation, referencing specific features in the landscape, like mountains and waterways. These groups held rights to use land and resources, rather than owning the land or resources themselves, and having the right to occupy land did not give you the right to alienate others from it without very special cause. The same isolation that evolved such a unique ecosystem evolved a unique culture to look after it. A culture we now know as Maori. As the Maori culture was taking shape, European explorers were beginning to sail into the Pacific, this massive blank spot on their map, believed to hold a vast southern continent. In 1642, Dutch explorer Abel Tasman is searching for this fabled continent when he encounters mountains rising out of the ocean. He maps a section of this new land's coast and returns to the Netherlands, where a mapmaker gives it a name, New Zealand. More than a century later, the Royal Society and British Admiralty have sent James Cook into the Pacific to search for the southern continent, map Australia's east coast, and get a better look at New Zealand, surveying it for potential resources or a future colony. They've told him that any indigenous groups he encounters here have legal ownership of their land, that Britain will need their permission to buy and occupy it. But they've also told him to go ahead and claim any good land for the crown, mostly so France can't take it. After more than a year of sailing, Cook's party reaches New Zealand. They claim the islands for the British crown and spend 6 months mapping their coastline. Their first landfall here sees conflict with a group of Maori, 4 of whom are killed, but before long, they establish a pretty good relationship. Over the next decade, Cook's expeditions returned to New Zealand twice more, refining their map, collecting samples of strange new plants, making observations and paintings. They explored fjords, islands, forests, vast wetlands, harvested trees, fished, hunted birds. They introduced their own species, rats and cats accidentally, and plenty more intentionally. Goats, pigs, chickens, geese, potatoes, carrots, turnips, parsnips, wheat, celery, garlic, onions, strawberries, beans, rabbits. And they returned to Britain with reports of massive flocks of parrots, rich seal colonies, vast forests of high-quality timber, and a perfect climate for growing European crops. These reports quickly attracted others. Sealers and whalers set up shore stations, flax merchants set up trading hubs on the northern coast, and by the end of the 1700s, this isolated place had become quite connected, linking with trading hubs in Australia to supply markets in China, India, Europe, and North America. Most early industries were short-lived. Sealing ramped up in the early 1800s, but exhausted populations by the 1820s. Whaling peaked in the 1840s, then crashed. In the 1820s, a timber industry developed, with small sawmills popping up along the northern coast. Coastal settlers gradually grew interested in New Zealand's interior. What resources might exist beyond these dense forests and high mountains? With the help of Maori guides, they made their first explorations, searching for routes across the mountains, following trails the Maori had made centuries before. Eventually, they reached the eastern side of the South Island, and where they expected big snowy mountains, they found this, the vast grassland left behind by Maori fires centuries before. The potential was obvious. This could become the world's largest sheep pasture. The colonial history of New Zealand is often split into 2 halves, before 1840 and after. Up to this point, Europeans in New Zealand played by Maori rules. Maori made up most of the population, controlled the economy and legal system. Merchants relied on them to allow access to their land, harvest and process resources, load cargo onto ships. They developed a jargon language they called whaler Maori to communicate. Some Maori worked as merchants and whalers themselves, sailing to Sydney and London. In 1840, Britain formally proclaimed a colony in New Zealand and signed a treaty with Maori chiefs from all around the country, the Treaty of Waitangi. It set up a colonial government to make laws for everyone in New Zealand, and it guaranteed the Maori full ownership and control of their land and resources unless they chose to sell them to the Crown. The treaty was translated in both English and Maori, but what the Maori translation didn't make clear is that the Crown had the sole right to negotiate land ownership. All transactions had to go through the government. Now, up to 1840, the Maori had made deals with individual settlers, allowing access to land and resources without an official written title. The Crown could now investigate those deals, decide that the Maori had sold the land outright, and deny their ownership. Within a decade, the Crown had taken most Maori land in their main hubs for settlement. With an increasing number of settlers coming in, they became more aggressive, poaching more and more titles to make room. In the 1850s, the Crown claimed nearly the entire South Island. In 1862, the Crown established the Native Land Court to review disputes over land ownership. To prove ownership of land, the court required maps or documentation of ownership. But remember, Maori land claims were based on ancestral narratives. Maori appeared before the court, singing or narrating ancestral stories, only to have their titles rejected. The mid-1800s saw growing Maori pushback. Groups organized, more than 1,000 petitions were sent to Parliament, armed conflicts broke out, and the Crown cracked down. British law would be the law of New Zealand. Anyone resisting it was a rebel, and rebels would be punished by, you guessed it, confiscation of their land. The Maori lost the vast majority of their land, with many pushed into remote mountainous areas unsuited for farming. The Treaty of Waitangi made a promise, the same promise Cook made 70 years before. The Crown broke that promise, again and again, until there were no promises left to break. After acquiring vast sections of land, the Crown got to work using it. Native grasslands were burned, plowed, and replanted with imported grasses like gorse and broom. Where forests stood in the way, they were burned or cut down. The most fertile land was in the wetlands, so these were drained and converted to pasture. This pasture was a perfect habitat for rabbits, so their populations exploded. They destroyed plants and eroded soil, causing hundreds of thousands of acres to be abandoned. Farmers spent much of their time just trying to control rabbits, hiring professional rabbiters to shoot, trap, poison, destroy burrows. Government rabbit inspectors surveyed farms. In the 1880s, the government tried to control the rabbit population by introducing their natural predators: ferrets, weasels, and stoats. But instead of hunting rabbits, they moved into the forests and started feasting on native birds and their eggs, absolutely tanking populations. With railroads expanding into more remote areas, forests were harvested faster and faster. And when these slow-growing indigenous forests started to run out, they were just replaced with plantations of faster-growing conifers imported from North America. In the 1860s, a gold rush brought an influx of new settlers, and a mining industry quickly expanded throughout New Zealand. Miners and other new settlers built small gardens, cultivating imported plants as a food source and just a reminder of home. As the colony grew, the gardens became larger, importing and experimenting with thousands of plants. Gardens in Australia once again linked New Zealand to the world, passing along plants from Europe, North America, China, India, Japan. In 1854, a naturalist in Paris founded the first acclimatization society, collecting more than 11,000 live animals from all around the world with the goal of introducing them to France. This wacky concept quickly caught on in the British colonies, deliberately breeding and introducing exotic animals for food, for sport, and just to see if they could do it. Acclimatization societies in New Zealand introduced dozens of new mammal species: deer, elk, hares, moose, tahr, chamois, trout, horses, pheasants, doves, possums. And the exchange went both ways. Plants, fossils, and taxidermied specimens from New Zealand were shipped to gardens, museums, and collectors all around the world. Strange birds like the kiwi fascinated scientists, challenging the known taxonomies of the time. The second half of the 19th century saw rapid environmental change all across New Zealand, but some areas remained relatively untouched, particularly the rugged mountains and fjords of the southwest. In 1885, a Maori leader on the North Island gifted a volcano to the government on the condition that they protect it, and it became New Zealand's first national park. The government even started setting aside some reserves of their own, places that were too rugged to settle or harvest. One of the very first reserves was Resolution Island in Dusky Sound, deep in the fjords of the southwest.
All right, I'm in a bird sanctuary hoping to see some takahe. These birds represent wildlife and nature in New Zealand really well. Their populations declined due to hunting, and in the mid-1800s, European settlers assumed that they were extinct. But in 1948, nearly 100 years later, a population of them was found living way out in these remote, rugged mountains of the fjord region. And now, as one of New Zealand's many conservation projects, that still very small and still endangered population is climbing its way back up.
During the second half of the 1800s, more than 700,000 settlers poured into New Zealand, including Richard Henry. Henry left Ireland as a child in 1851, moving to Australia and eventually New Zealand. He worked odd jobs: sawmiller, shepherd, rabbiter, gardener, taxidermist. As a taxidermist, he spent time hunting and working with many of New Zealand's strange native birds. One in particular caught his eye: the kakapo. In the 1880s, Henry notes that kakapo populations are quickly declining at the hands of introduced stoats and weasels. He tries to convince the government and scientific community, but his claims fall on deaf ears. In 1884, he's hired as the caretaker of Resolution Island in Dusky Sound. This place is about as remote as it gets, with miserable weather and dangerous waters. But Henry has an idea. On the mainland, he starts hunting for kakapos. His dog sniffs them out, and then he catches them and puts them in a pen. Once he's collected enough birds, he loads them into a small boat and rows them across the fjord to Resolution Island. This is dangerous work, with kakapos drowning and Henry coming close several times. But he repeats this process for years, moving more than 700 birds from the mainland to Resolution Island. Mostly kakapo, but also kiwi and weka. This was a great idea. With introduced mammals spreading across New Zealand, these islands were kind of time capsules of an undisturbed ecosystem. The main islands of New Zealand had provided the refuge from mammals millions of years before, and now these smaller islands could do the same. 5 years in, a tour boat in Dusky Sound tells Henry that they've spotted something on Resolution Island. He spends months searching, eventually finding it. A stoat that had managed to swim to the island. That year, he retires. He spends 8 more years moving birds, but he knows it's futile. With stoats quickly populating the island, the kakapo will soon be extinct. It took less than a decade for stoats to kill every kakapo on Resolution Island. Countless native species have gone extinct, and so many others have faced steep population declines. Some, like the South Island kokako, are right on the edge, presumed extinct, with occasional unconfirmed sightings in remote areas. The main causes for such declines are predation and competition from introduced mammals, and habitat loss. 85% of New Zealand's wetlands have been drained, and more than half of New Zealand's land area has been converted to pasture. Gorse and broom have become widespread and invasive, snuffing out native grasslands and preventing forests from regenerating. Forests are further restricted by grazing deer, possums, goats, pigs. Millions of acres of native forest have been cleared or harvested, much of it replaced by plantations of imported conifers. Even deep in the fjords, ships releasing ballast water has introduced invasive seaweeds and algae. And looking around, it can be hard not to see a centuries-old colonial dream realized. The forest at the bottom of the world turned into the world's largest farm. But again, this landscape has been built out of contradictions. At the tail end of the 1800s, things were starting to shift in New Zealand. Native timber was running out. Pastures had expanded about as much as they could, and production was plateauing. Steamboats filled with tourists were flocking into the fjords. European settlers were becoming interested in outdoor recreation, and as a result, native birds. Gardens were showing off more indigenous plants. People were beginning to realize that New Zealand's indigenous landscape was pretty sweet, and that it was disappearing before their eyes. With an eye for tourism, the government started setting aside land. Millions of acres, including Fiordland, this landscape of steep mountains and fjords in the southwest, too rugged to settle or exploit. They began investigating and regulating whaling, sealing, and fisheries. They limited exports of native timber, banned hunting of native species, tuatara in 1895, kiwi in 1897. Conservation groups published guidebooks, advocated for protection of new land, consulted on government policy, helped manage reserves. Schools began teaching classes about indigenous nature. The native ecosystem came to symbolize national identity. Richard Henry's work on Resolution Island was a proof of concept. The hundreds of islands dotting the lakes, the fjords, and the coast, these could be the key to saving endangered species. It just had to be done right. And in the century since, New Zealand's conservationists have worked to do it right. They've identified islands far enough from the mainland that stoats and rats can't reach them, eradicated introduced predators from more than 100 others, and set up dozens of refuges for kiwi, short-tailed bats, tuatara, South Island saddleback, Fiordland skinks, geckos, that giant insect. New Zealand's conservation movement really caught on here. Lake Manapori in Fiordland. In 1959, New Zealand's government announced plans for a hydro project here. They built the largest underground power station in the entire southern hemisphere, redirected water from the lake to power it, and they planned to increase output by raising the lake's water level by 8 meters, submerging 17 islands. People were pissed, and the result was New Zealand's first large environmental campaign. In 1972, the incumbent government lost re-election, largely thanks to this project, and the power station was required to keep the lake at its natural level. The next year, another campaign prevented a similar project from raising the level of Lake Wanaka. Other campaigns focused on protecting native forests, waterways, marine life, birds. In 1975, the Waitangi Tribunal was established, investigating Maori claims that the Treaty of Waitangi had been broken and returning land. In 1987, the Department of Conservation was founded, the first government agency focused solely on conservation. One of their first moves was preventing the extinction of yellow-eyed penguins, teaming up with local farmers and a cheese company to control predators and restore habitat. In Fiordland's Eglinton Valley, the department is building their first mainland island, carefully controlling predators to maintain a refuge for endangered birds and bats. Since 2016, conservationists have been working toward a goal of completely eradicating invasive species, developing more advanced traps, and placing thousands across the country. Rather than just big mountains and fjords, reserves have started to include wetlands and native grasslands. Wild goats, deer, cattle, and sheep have been largely controlled. The seals are coming back. The sea lions are coming back. The whales are coming back. In 1975, scientists in a remote part of Fiordland find something. A kakapo, the only one known to exist at the time. In 1977, a population of about 200 kakapos is found living on a large offshore island, being hunted by cats and quickly declining. They're immediately moved to smaller islands, including Chalky Island. In August of 2022, conservation workers found a single stoat on Chalky Island. They did what Richard Henry couldn't a century before. At 3 million acres, Fiordland is the largest national park in New Zealand and one of the world's largest intact temperate rainforests. Most of it is roadless. These forests haven't been burned or logged, and some remote pockets are believed to be New Zealand's last possum-free forests. Invasive plants have only taken root along the park's edges, and most of the park's wetlands were never drained. For many of New Zealand's endangered species, this is the last refuge on the mainland. This region has yielded hundreds of species new to science. Some are yet to be described. Others have been spotted only once or twice. Species once believed extinct have been rediscovered hiding deep in these mountains, and surely plenty of new species remain to be found. I can't stop thinking about this place. And what stuck with me isn't what I saw here, but what I didn't. It's the feeling of looking into the twisted stands of rainforest, the murky black water of the fjords, across the ridges of the mountains, and wondering what's on the other side. 200 years ago, colonists looked into this expanse and saw only despair, an impenetrable barrier in their quest to fill in blank spots on a map, to open and illuminate this landscape. Today there is hope hiding in the shadows. Who knows what may survive here, out of sight? What new discoveries, new species? Looking into the bush, I think back on the species we've lost, and can't help imagining that some of these bizarre creatures still survive here. The same way they've survived here for millions of years. By hiding just out of view.